Hi everyone, Dr. Mike here. In this video, we're going to take a look at the endocrine system. Now, the endocrine system is a collection of cells and glands that produce and release hormones. These hormones are just chemicals that jump into the bloodstream and have their effect in distant areas of the body. Now, it's a communication network similar to the nervous system that controls physiological activity, but it's a little bit different. It's different in the sense that the nervous system is very fast, it's very direct, and usually it's short-acting. The endocrine system is the opposite. So it's quite slow to have its effect. It isn't direct because it jumps into the bloodstream and travels to very distant areas of the body, and it can last a long time. Some hormones, when they're released, can have their effects that last hours to days to sometimes weeks. So in this video, we're going to go through some of the important cells or glands that produce and release hormones and go through what these hormones are and have a quick look at their activity or function in the body. We're going to do this a top to toe mechanism. Start at the top and move our way down. So to begin, we need to start at the brain. Specifically, at the base of the brain, there's something called the hypothalamus, which is telling you it sits below the thalamus. This is the hypothalamus. It sits here. We've taken it across here. Here's the hypothalamus, and you can see that there's an extension of the hypothalamus that has two lobes to it, or two parts. This is called the pituitary gland, and that's another endocrine tissue or gland that itself produces and releases hormones. The hypothalamus produces a number of hormones that has its effect to control and regulate the endocrine system of many other tissues of the body. So we call the hypothalamus the master regulator or the control center of the endocrine system. Now, 5 important hormones that the hypothalamus produces and releases to control many other aspects of the endocrine system. These hormones are thyrotropin releasing hormone, corticotropin releasing hormone, growth hormone releasing hormone, prolactin releasing hormone, and gonadotropin releasing hormone. So a couple of points here. Releasing hormone tells you it goes somewhere else to release a hormone. All right, makes sense. Also, tropin as a suffix. Tropin sitting at the end of the word. If you see a hormone with tropin as a suffix, it means it's going to go to another tissue of the body to tell it to release another hormone. All right? So, how does this work? Well, the hypothalamus talks to both aspects of the pituitary gland, posterior and anterior. But interestingly, the anterior is connected to the hypothalamus through a blood supply, which means the only way the hypothalamus can talk to it is it releases hormones, and they travel through this blood supply to tell the anterior pituitary gland to release its hormones. The posterior pituitary gland is connected to the hypothalamus through nerves, which means the hypothalamus doesn't need to release hormones to tell the posterior to do it. It just sends a nervous signal down to tell the posterior to release hormones. All right, these hormones that I've named here that the hypothalamus produces moves through the blood supply to the anterior pituitary to tell the anterior pituitary to release a number of hormones. Number 1, the hormone that is told to be released from the anterior pituitary gland is thyroid stimulating hormone. The second hormone, now there's no particular order, I'm just ordering it here for ease basically, but there's no particular order. But the second hormone that's released is adrenocorticotropic hormone. The third is growth hormone. The fourth is prolactin. And the fifth is the gonadotropins. Gonadotropins, and there's 2 gonadotropins you need to know. That is luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. All right, what happens? Thyrotropin releasing hormone released from the hypothalamus stimulates the release of thyroid stimulating hormone. This is a hormone that now jumps into the bloodstream and goes to the thyroid to tell it to release its hormone. So let's have a look at this. Number 1 tells that one to be released. That jumps into the bloodstream, goes to the thyroid. So let's have a look at the thyroid quickly. The thyroid is endocrine tissue that hugs the front of your trachea, your windpipe. And what you'll find is that the thyroid produces a couple of important hormones. It produces T3, which is also known as triiodothyronine, and T4, which is known as thyroxine. Interestingly, T4, or most of it, is turned into T3. T3 is the most active thyroid hormone. So when we talk about thyroid hormones, we're talking about T3 predominantly. 80%, 20%, that's the ratio that we see here. There's another hormone that's released by the thyroid called calcitonin. Calcitonin. Talk about that in a sec. So, thyrotropin releasing hormones released by the hypothalamus, travels down this blood supply, tells the anterior pituitary to release thyroid stimulating hormone. That jumps into the bloodstream, tells the thyroid to release T3 and T4. What do? They play an extremely important role in metabolism, development, and catecholamine release. What's catecholamine? Catecholamines are neurotransmitters. These are things, and hormones, are things like adrenaline or noradrenaline or epinephrine, norepinephrine, for example. That's what thyroid hormones do. Calcitonin is interesting. What calcitonin does is it decreases the amount of calcium in the bloodstream. If there's too much calcium in the bloodstream, calcitonin drops that calcium down, helps us reabsorb and hold on to that calcium, predominantly in our bony tissue. That's the thyroid hormone. What happens when corticotropin releasing hormone is released from the hypothalamus, traveling through this blood supply, stimulates adrenocorticotropic hormone to be released, also known as ACTH. That jumps into the bloodstream and travels to adrenal gland, cortico, the outside of the adrenal gland, tropic is it's telling it to release another hormone. So it's all in the name. Let's go to the adrenal gland now. The adrenal gland. Now, if we look at the adrenal gland, you've got the cortex, which is the outside of it, like the shell of it, and you've got the medulla, which is the inside. They release different hormones. So for example, adrenocorticotropic hormone will go to the cortex more specifically and release cortisol, and it will release aldosterone and androgens. We'll leave androgens out, but androgens, which are male sex hormones. So cortisol, what does cortisol do? Cortisol increases blood glucose. Cortisol also suppresses the immune system. And cortisol also stimulates our fight or flight response, really importantly. What does aldosterone do? Aldosterone increases our reabsorption of salt. What does that mean? Increases our reabsorption of salt. Aldosterone travels to our kidneys and tells our kidneys, don't pee out that salt or that sodium, keep it in the blood. This is important because wherever sodium goes, water follows. So if we reabsorb more sodium into our bloodstream, water follows and it increases our blood volume, which means it increases our blood pressure. Aldosterone helps increase blood pressure, increase blood volume, and also maintain hydration. Really important. What about the medulla? Well, the medulla isn't stimulated very strongly at all by ACTH, but the hormones that are released by the inside of the adrenal gland are predominantly noradrenaline and adrenaline. What are they? That's norepinephrine and epinephrine. All right, what else? Growth hormone. Okay, growth hormone is released from the anterior pituitary gland, and that stimulates growth. Unsurprisingly, growth hormone stimulates growth. Increase growth. Things like increased protein synthesis, for example. increases growth, increases metabolic processes. All right, prolactin. Prolactin, lactation, the production of breast milk. Prolactation. So prolactin, which is released by the anterior pituitary gland in response to prolactin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus, that stimulates milk production. Increases milk production. Now, it's not milk ejection, which is let down through breastfeeding. That's oxytocin, which I'm going to talk about in a second. And then the gonadotropins. The gonadotropins, so tropin, it's going to the gonads. So for the females, the ovaries; for the males, the testes. And these hormones go to both. For females, goes to the ovaries; for males, goes to the testes, and has their function. What is their function? All right, luteinizing hormone. Let's look at the ovaries first. What luteinizing hormone does is it stimulates progesterone. It also stimulates ovulation. Ovulation and progesterone. Follicle stimulating hormone stimulates follicle maturation. What's that mean? In the female reproductive cycle, you've got these immature primordial follicles. They ultimately turn into an oocyte, or an egg that gets released. So FSH, released by the hypothalamus, well, specifically the anterior pituitary gland, stimulates these follicles to start moving through the process to go towards the release of a mature egg. The actual release of the egg is luteinizing hormone. So follicle maturation also leads to estrogen. So two really important hormones that are released here in response to LH is progesterone, and FSH, estrogen. What about in the testes? Let's have a look. For males in the testes. Well, luteinizing hormone stimulates a certain type of cells called Leydig cells. And what they produce is testosterone. That's the hormone produced here, testosterone. What about follicle stimulating hormone? Well, there's no follicles in males, but what it does is it stimulates a certain type of cells in the testes called Sertoli cells. So both Leydig and Sertoli cells are in the testes. Leydig produces testosterone. Sertoli produces something called androgen binding protein. And both of these bind together to promote sperm production. So, unsurprisingly, the ovaries, luteinizing hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, produced hormones here, and what this does is it leads to uterus preparation. So if you're preparing the uterus and producing sperm, both of these things coming together is going to support reproduction. That's going through the anterior hormones. What about those of the posterior pituitary hormones? There's only two you need to know here. There's oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone, known as ADH, also known as vasopressin. All right. Firstly, hypothalamus doesn't produce any hormones to travel down to tell them to be released. It's just a nerve signal. In actual fact, the hypothalamus produces these two hormones and sends them down, and they're simply stored in the posterior pituitary gland. Now, what oxytocin does is, we know it's an important hormone for building relationships, but it also tells smooth muscle to contract, tells the uterus to contract, and tells the smooth muscle in the breast to contract to eject milk. So uterine contractions and milk ejection. In addition to building relationships, both positive and negative. It's not that feel-good hormone that everyone says. Antidiuretic hormone. Diuresis means to release urine, to release fluid from the body. It's antidiuresis, so it stops the release of that fluid, so it stops peeing. So this hormone gets released in times of dehydration. If we need to maintain water, we release this hormone, This travels to the kidneys, and the kidneys hold on to water and we don't pee it out. So it stops urination. It's there to maintain hydration. All right, so that's the hypothalamus pituitary glands. We've gone through the adrenal glands. We've gone through the sex hormones and the thyroid. There's a hormone, or I should say there's a gland that sits behind the thyroid called the parathyroid gland. And what the parathyroid gland is, it releases parathyroid hormone. And it opposes the activity of calcitonin. So calcitonin decreases calcium, parathyroid hormone increases blood calcium. So if our calcium's too low, parathyroid releases parathyroid hormone, calcium jumps up. If calcium's too high, calcitonin's released, and it drops calcium levels. Can you see that what's happening here is the endocrine system maintains homeostasis, maintains function for the body? Brilliant. That's the parathyroid hormone. The kidneys also release some hormones. Renin, for example, and erythropoietin. What renin does is it works in conjunction to aldosterone. Increases blood pressure, increases blood volume. Erythropoietin increases red blood cell production. Why would the kidneys be in control of red blood cell production? Well, because the kidneys need to maintain itself being fed oxygen because it's such a hungry tissue. So red blood cell production. The pancreas, we can't forget about the pancreas. The pancreas is both an endocrine tissue and an exocrine. Exocrine means it produces chemicals that get released into ducts. These ducts are contained, and this is part of the digestive system. So it releases digestive enzymes, but it also releases hormones. Two really important hormones are insulin and glucagon. And again, these are opposing hormones. So insulin drops blood glucose levels when they're high, drops blood glucose. Glucagon increases blood glucose levels. After a meal, insulin's released, pulls the glucose into the cells to be used for energy. If we're not eating and it's been 4 to 6, 8 hours and we haven't eaten, glucagon's released and it releases stored glucose into the bloodstream, and then the cells can use it for energy. And so what we've had a look at here is a relatively quick run through and overview of the endocrine system.